Hiya, welcome to LSB Feasters Radio Channel and Travel Corner. Today, it's back to Philadelphia with 93.3 WMMR. WMMR has been rocking Philadelphia since 1968, when it started as a progressive rock station. In fact, the call letters MMR actually stands for Metro Media Radio. Metro Media owns several progressive rock stations, and MMR adopted its programming from some of the other stations. In the chain, you had Cleveland's WMMS, you had KMET Los Angeles, KSAN in San Francisco, and New York's WNEW. Now, NEW and MMR actually had a very close relationship. The stations ran similar promotions, and they even traded some of their jocks back and forth over the years through the 60s and 70s. Dave Herman was WMMR's first rock jock with the Marconi Experiment back in 1968. And some of the legendary voices we've heard on WMMR over the year include Michael Tierson, Ed Shockey, David Dye, Nick Spencer, Carol Miller, Dave Herman, of course. If you like what you hear, give it a thumbs up, and also feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you like what you hear, smack that bell after you subscribe so you can get updates whenever we post anything new, which is normally weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. So let's go way back to the guy who got it all started, Dave Herman, on 93.3 WMMR Philadelphia.
Herman here on the Marconi Experiment at WMMR, Metro Media Stereo in Philadelphia. FM 93.3. Guitar gently weeps. A composition of George Harrison's, and probably his best. Of course, Paul and John have contributed the overwhelming portion of material to the Beatles. The first thing that the Beatles ever recorded that George Harrison wrote wasn't until 1963, when the first George Harrison song appeared on an album, a song called Don't Bother Me, in the With the Beatles album. 1964 passed without anything on records that George wrote. Then in 1965, there were two songs in the film Help that George wrote, one called I Need You and another called You Like Me Too Much. Then on the Rubber Soul album, George wrote Think for Yourself. A couple of things on the Revolver album like Taxman. And then, of course, Within You, Without You, one of George Harrison's most beautiful compositions, appearing on the Sgt. Pepper album, and then on the double LP, The Beatles, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, contributed by Mr. Harrison. But probably the most ambitious writing effort that George Harrison involved himself with was around the same time that he wrote Within You, Without You, during some time that he was spending in India when the Beatles were involved very much with the Maharishi. He wrote the score of a film called Wonderwall. The album wasn't released until about a year after he wrote the music. But there are some beautiful things on George Harrison's Wonderwall album. Here's a track that features Eric Clapton on guitar and Ringo Starr on the drums. Listed under the personnel on the album cover is Eddie Clayton instead of Eric Clapton. And Ringo has a pseudonym as well. From George Harrison's Wonderwall album, this is called The Party Seacombe. The Party Seacombe, from George Harrison's Wonderwall LP. There's an album due out shortly, which will be the second album that George Harrison composed and put together by himself, and it'll be an album of electronic music on a new subsidiary label that Apple is forming called Zapple Records. Zapple. And there'll be an album of electronic music coming out shortly, again from George Harrison. In just a minute, we will discuss the Beatles' period when they involved themselves with drugs and with the Maharishi, and we'll be getting to that in just a second. All of the Beatle music that you're hearing on the program tonight and all this week here at WMMR is available at the Wellington Car Stereo Centers, all of them, all around the greater Delaware Valley area. And any Beatles stereo tape cartridge all this week on sale for just $3.84. That's right, all the Capitol Beatles tapes, just $3.84. And they've got all the heavies, Sgt. Pepper, The Magical Mystery Tour, The Yellow Submarine, Help, Rubber Soul, Yesterday and Today, Revolver. Everything's happening as far as the Beatles are concerned at the Wellington Car Stereo Centers. And all this week, to help celebrate the first anniversary of the Marconi Experiment, they're selling them at just $3.84, with more than 15 great Beatles stereo tapes available. This week only, at any Wellington Car Stereo Center, only $3.84. Wellington Car Centers on City Line Avenue, 69th Street, Route 13 in the Levittown, Bristol area, the new center on Route 45 in Woodbury, opposite McDonald's, one at 18th and Cheltenham, and they're all open 6 nights a week.
FM 93.3.
The world champion Detroit Tigers face the Phillies in the 21st Annual Junior Baseball Federation Game. The date is Monday, May 5th at Connie Mack Stadium.
Have to remember when you talk about the Beatles, although their music started happening in 1961, that the union between John and Paul went back to 1956 when the two of them first met and started fiddling around with music together. They picked up George Harrison a year or two later, also in the late 50s, and the drummer with the band originally was Pete Best. So by the time 1966 rolled around, which was the end of all the Beatlemania and all the touring that the Beatles had been doing, they'd really had spent about 10 years together, living kind of a communal life and living almost the same life. They were still each other's greatest friends. They were still going to record together, but as individuals, they felt it was time to look for a separate identity. And it was really the youngest Beatle of all, George, who got them started on a different kind of a track back then in 1956 when George left England with his wife and went to India. George's passion for Indian music, Indian religion, and Indian philosophy started to grow, and he was sending word back home to his fellow Beatles about this incredible new insight that he was starting to learn. And it was then that drugs first came into the Beatles' life. Now, the Beatles had been taking pep pills of varying strengths ever since the Hamburg days, and they had occasionally a marijuana cigarette, as other people have a drink, because none of the Beatles drink. None of them do, apart from a little wine with a meal now and then. George and John were first introduced to LSD through a dental friend. That was in 1965, and they didn't realize it. It was kind of slipped to them. But later on, George said it was as if I'd never tasted, talked, seen, thought, or heard properly before. He said, for the first time in my life, I wasn't conscious of ego. It was because of that experience that George went to India, and then was followed by the rest of the Beatles, and they too got very much involved in things Indian, both mystical, religious, philosophic, and musically. It was then that they met the Maharishi Yogi, and spent about close to a year in India studying and meditating with him. At the conclusion of their journey in India, the Beatles wrote a song about the Maharishi.
Day after day,
Beatles, first with their song for the Maharishi Yogi, The Fool on the Hill, and then Dear Prudence. Our thanks to McGraw-Hill, the publishers of Hunter Davies' book of the authorized biography of the Beatles, called The Beatles, and selling widely and on sale now, for all of the information that we are sending your way during these 5 nights of the Beatle Festival. Just to get it on the record, we thought you might be interested in the list of the albums that have been released in the United States. The first LP to be released by the Beatles was in 1964 by VJ Records, an album called Introducing the Beatles, but all of the material on that LP was subsequently introduced, or rather re-recorded and re-released by Capitol Records. In June of 1964, United Artists released the album of The Music of a Hard Day's Night film. Also in January of 1964, 6 months before the Hard Day's Night movie, the first Capitol LP called Meet the Beatles. In April 64, the Beatles' second album is what it was called. And towards the end of 1964, an album called Something New. In November 1964, a documentary album was released called The Beatles Story, On Stage with the Beatles. In 1965, there were 3 albums released. Beatles 65, The Early Beatles, which was some of the things that they had done back in 63 that didn't come out in the United States until March of 65. And then in June 65, Beatles 6. And then in August 65, only 3 months later, the album Help was released. And then at the end of the year, December of 1965, Rubber Soul. 1965 was the year that more new music by the Beatles was released than in any other year. In June 1966, Capitol released Yesterday and Today. In August 66, the Revolver album came out, which was a complete departure from anything that they had done. And then in June of 1967, almost a full year later, they revolutionized the direction that popular music was taking in the world with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In November of 1967, the Magical Mystery Tour album was released. In 1968, the fantastic double LP called The Beatles. And the next Beatle album has been promised for June, but I think that you would be more correct if you figured its release for July. So we should be getting something new from the Beatles in just a few more months. The beautiful Beatles Festival with Herman here on WMMR. And we are concluding our second of 20 hours. You're listening to part 1 of the beautiful Beatles Festival. Herman here on the Marconi Experiment at WMMR, Metro Media Stereo in Philadelphia.
400 cycles per second reference tape, 71867, recorded at ultrasonic operating level.
And this is the Vanilla Fudge. Vanilla Fudge, who have always used Beatle material quite generously in their repertoire, and Ticket to Ride. In just a minute, the first recording ever made by the Beatles, back to Hamburg, Germany in 1961. And we'll make that trip in just a minute.
FM 93.3
Help support the work of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Buy daisies on Daisy Days, May 7, 8, 9, and 10.
When I was born, I had no head. My eye was single, and my body was filled with light. And the light that I was the light that I saw by.
And the light that I saw by was the light that I was. And many's the time that I've passed by the river,
and saw no tollman, and needed no ferryman to cross. And I enjoyed the world aright, for the sea itself floweth, and warm I was and clothed. When I was born, I had no head.
The incredible string band is back with 2 new albums of poetry to music, Wee Tam and The Big Huge, on Electra.
It's a beautiful commercial. The Incredible String Band, and they'll be here in Philadelphia to be witnessed live this Sunday at 8 p.m. at Philadelphia's Academy of Music.
Red letter day is a lucky day, an exciting day. It's the day you'll receive your red letter. Red letter. receive your red letter, when you redeem your red letter, it will be your red letter day.
A Metro Mail concept.
In 1961, the Beatles were known really only to audiences in Liverpool. And then somebody who ran a nightclub in Hamburg, Germany, heard them, saw the reaction to the people, and invited the Beatles to Hamburg, Germany, where they became even more popular than they were in Liverpool, playing in Hamburg. Here is a recording made in those days, back in 1961. This features John Lennon on the vocal, George Harrison and Paul McCartney on guitars, and Pete Best on the drums. Pete, shortly after these recordings were made, was replaced by Ringo Starr. So here is the first record that the Beatles ever made. We'll do one more recording from 1961. This is an instrumental that George Harrison and John Lennon wrote, which is an unusual combination. George Harrison and John Lennon wrote this song called Cry for a Shadow, recorded by the Beatles in Germany in 1961, an instrumental thing. Cry for a Shadow, George Harrison and John Lennon's composition, vintage 1961. And we span the years to 1968. Arthur Conley, another good recording of the Beatles' Obladi. Oblada, life goes on. Love me do.